Well, good evening, and thanks so much for coming out. My name is Andrew Graybill, and I'm a professor of history here at SMU. We are delighted to have you here for the first of two nights for our symposium, West of the White House, which explores the role of executive power in shaping the American frontier in the 19th and 20th centuries. And we will do, since of course we follow chronological order, right down to the order of our presenters on stage today, the 19th century tonight and the 20th century tomorrow. Many folks have come from across campus to help us make this event possible, and I want to thank them for their support, starting especially with our pals at the Center for Presidential History, Rana. Don't go anywhere, especially Rana Spitz. Thank you, Rana. Thanks also to the Clements Center for Southwest Studies, including its director, Ariel Ron, and assistant director, Ruth Ann Elmore. Thanks also to Carissa Cloward, who's the director of the Dedman College Interdisciplinary Institute, for a very generous internal grant. Thank you also to Jeffrey Engel, who's sitting in the back over there, the director of the Center for Presidential History, and Cecily Zander, who is up here on stage, who is an assistant professor of history at Texas Women's University, with whom I'm working as co-editors of the volume that will result from this symposium. And to be fair, this symposium was really their idea, and probably especially Cecily's. I'm sort of an interloper in this, so I tip my cap to you and to Jeff. And finally, thanks to the participants who graciously accepted our invitation to contribute to this conference and edited collection and to come all the way to Dallas to do so from places far and wide. So our plan for these two evenings is pretty straightforward. I'll introduce the speakers up front and give each of them roughly 5 minutes to discuss their prospective essay, and then we'll reserve the balance of time, hopefully at least a half hour, for audience Q&A. And I think that we will have folks come in sort of mass in the aisle here at the end, after all of our speakers have had an opportunity to talk about their work, and we'll have you speak into the mic. And one of the reasons for that is it makes it a little cleaner and neater for our friends who are recording this event this evening. Okay, our presenters in order over here. Nick Guyatt is professor of history at Cambridge University. He's a historian and lecturer in modern history and a fellow of Jesus College. After earning degrees at Cambridge and a PhD at Princeton, he taught American history in the US, Canada, and the UK. He's the author of 6 books, including The Hated Cage, published by Basic in 2022, and Bind Us Apart, How Enlightened Americans Invented Racial Segregation, also published by Basic in 2016. Andrew Isenberg is the Hall Distinguished Professor of American History at the University of Kansas. He was born in Chicago and studied at St. Olaf College and Northwestern University. He's a historian of the American West, American environmental history, and American Indian history, although he's probably best known as my PhD advisor. So we're going to be working out a little Luke Vader thing tonight, so don't let that be awkward for you all. Carolyn Levy is an instructional consultant in the Center for Teaching and Learning at the University of Washington, where she also serves as an affiliate assistant professor in the Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies Department. She earned a dual title PhD in History and Women's and Gender and Sexuality Studies from Penn State in 2022, and she spent 1 year here at SMU as a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Presidential History in 2022-23. Her research focuses on carceral history in the United States, with particular focus on women's prison reform efforts throughout the 19th century. Cecily Zander is an assistant professor of history at Texas Women's University and a senior fellow at SMU's Center for Presidential History, where she was a postdoctoral fellow for a couple of years. Her first book, The Army Under Fire, Anti-Militarism in the Civil War Era, was published by LSU this past February, and I've read it. It's really good. She's published essays on the Civil War and the American West in edited collections, scholarly journals, and popular magazines. Mallory Heward is assistant professor of history at Hood College and a scholar of the 19th century United States with interests in women's history and gender studies. She holds degrees from Gettysburg College and Pennsylvania State University, and her research has been supported by the Massachusetts Historical Society. Her book in progress is titled At Home Overseas, Capitalism, Domesticity, and Transnational Families in 19th Century Hawaii. So Nick, we will start with you, reminding you that you have a 5-minute budget, and I'll be making faces at you from the audience if you go over.
Well, okay. Well, hi, everyone. Very nice to see you all. Just want to thank again Ronna in particular, and also Jeff and Cecily and Andy for organizing this. I have two anxieties, which I'll mention up front. Let's leave the time to one side. The first anxiety is that I speak too quickly. I'm really sorry. It's even true in England, so I'm going to try and slow things down just a little bit. The second anxiety is that, this is such an awesome topic, and these papers are great. But I kind of feel like my anxiety for this session is that all five of us are talking about slightly different things. And rather than seeing this as a kind of integrated whole, this feels to you like a series of one-night stands, which I think would be bad. So without moralizing too much about that and thinking about that more structurally, what I want to do is give you maybe a minute or two's kind of brief about what I wrote about. And then I've put on my computer, which I'll hoist up, some questions that I think come out of what I've been doing, but that I think may also be questions that could help us kind of tie together some of the themes that are in the other papers too, and that we might also turn to when we get into discussion. So I'll give you just a really, really quick sense of what I wrote about. I'm kind of accidentally writing a book about Thomas Jefferson. If you're an academic, sometimes you accidentally write a book, and that's where I am right now. And so when I got asked to be involved in this, which is a fantastic invitation to get, I kind of thought, okay, well, let's talk about Jefferson and the frontier. And I think we know a lot about Jefferson and the frontier. We know that he was really important in a number of kind of crucial early moments in a relationship between the US and the West. So I'm thinking in particular here about, say, the 1784 first draft of what becomes the Northwest Ordinance, which is a really big deal, right? Because it introduces the principle of equal footing. I can say a lot more about equal footing, but I think we don't talk about it as much as we should. It's a big deal. Obviously, Jefferson is involved in crafting the so-called civilization policy, so basically early Indian policy, and then kind of overseeing that for 8 years when he's in the White House. And of course, Jefferson is the guy that races to close the deal on the Louisiana Purchase. So it's kind of weird because in all of these ways, you think of Jefferson as being a kind of iconically pro-West figure, but we also know that the West is a space of federal power. We know from people like Gregory Oblasky, Bethel Saylor, and other historians who've kind of written about the territorial system. The federal government is kind of more powerful, at least in theory, in the West than almost anywhere else. So Jefferson spends the 1790s going around complaining about Washington, but mostly about Hamilton, and saying that, this guy is crazy, there's way too much centralization of power. Then he spends 8 years really centralizing power in the West. So in my paper, I try and think about, what's going on with that. And the very, very basic, but maybe serviceable argument is that actually Jefferson thinks about the West through the lens of Virginia. And I won't get into it all now, but basically from the 1760s onwards, Jefferson comes to think that the western bit of Virginia might be a way of redistributing political power within the colony initially in a way that takes power away from the big enslavers. And actually then he kind of ratchets up that vision to thinking about the West. And the paper kind of charts all the ways in which his hopes that release of the West, that kind of empowering of the West as a space that might make slavery wither in the East, just goes horribly wrong. So that's one context in which he thinks about the West through Virginia. Another is that basically every single person that he kind of knows or has out there that's giving him intel about the West or is serving in a federal position. So I'm thinking here about people like William Claiborne, who was the territorial governor in New Orleans just after the purchase. So the territory of Orleans is the one that he's in charge of. And also William Henry Harrison. It's a very, very important figure who's the territorial governor in Indiana during Jefferson's presidency. Both Virginians. Lewis and Clark, not just Virginians, they're from Albemarle County, where Jefferson grew up. George Rogers Clark, Clark's brother, very, very important in Jefferson's earlier career, another Virginian. So there's this weird way in which all of these different Virginians are a really, really important part of the way that Jefferson processes the West. And he never goes. He doesn't make it further than the Blue Ridge. So that, I think, is a really interesting question, the relationship between Jefferson's kind of mythologizing of the West, if you like, and the fact that he doesn't have that personal experience and is instead relying on all this intel. So anyway, that's kind of basically where the paper goes. It ends with Missouri. You guys probably, some of you may know, that in his last years, so 5 years before he dies in 1821, Jefferson has this quite embarrassing moment where he's like, hey, why don't we just agree that Missouri should come into the Union as a slave state? And people are like, dude, you're the anti-slavery guy. How is that possible? The Marquis de Lafayette writes to him and says, are you sure the best way to get rid of slavery is by extending it? And Jefferson turns around and says, basically, this is what will help me get rid of slavery in Virginia. So even at that point, he's thinking if you can free enslaved people or move slavery to the West, it will make it easier for enslavers in Virginia to end slavery. So that's what's in the paper. Just in terms of some things that I think come out of what I've done that might possibly help to kind of connect other questions we might be looking at tonight and tomorrow. I mean, one of the first questions is like, I should actually look at my list or I'm going to forget. One of the first questions is like, where is the West? What is the West? For Jefferson, there were many Wests. So I just want, first of all, to kind of capture the idea of the West as a moving target, but also to say that for Jefferson, there may have been many Wests in operation at once. Second question we might try and think about, does that personal experience matter? If you're around tomorrow for T.J. Stiles' presentation, he's got some very interesting things to say about T.R., who knew the West. Does it make a difference that T.R. knew the West and T.J., not Stiles, but Jefferson, didn't? Is thinking about the frontier different from thinking about the West? Frontier is the word we're using here. I very sloppily and lazily allow some slippage between the two in my paper, but actually thinking of the frontier, a kind of border or an edge between US claims and whatever lies beyond them, is that different than thinking about the West as this kind of big banded space? I'm nearly done. The centrality of indigenous dispossession. I really struggle with this. I mean, I'm a Brit. Maybe it should be easier for me. I find it really hard to process, package, and account for the sheer enormity of the fact of indigenous dispossession in Jefferson's vision of republicanism. I don't know what to do with it. I mean, genuinely. It's like everything rests on it. I mean, clearly, even in Jefferson's mind, it's a massive injustice, even though he can tell himself stories about why he's not completely to blame. But whenever I come back and think about him in the West, I try and grapple with that. How do we do a kind of moral accounting for that and then just carry on telling history? And then finally, how does the West become such a focus for federal and especially for executive power? And I think one interesting thing that might come through this panel even is we may not all agree on just how much of a focus for executive power it is. But I think Jefferson's key to understanding how that story gets started, but maybe we'll see where it goes with the other papers. Okay, thank you very much, everyone.
Hey, everybody. Thank you, Nick, and thanks to Cecily and to Jeff and to Andy for putting this thing together. So I'm not as clever as Nick, so I'm going to have notes that I need to go off of here. So when Andy asked me to do this, participate in this, I was finishing up a book on borderlands in the first half of the 19th century, North American borderlands. And it strikes me, having worked on that book, there are three things that I want to draw from that I think apply to the frontier and the American presidency. And the first one is this. Between the Louisiana Purchase in 1803 and the beginning of the US-Mexico War in 1846, the United States asserted its sovereignty over a huge chunk of the western half of the continent, but it was a sovereignty that the United States could do little more than assert. The United States could not imagine challenging the power of groups such as the Ojibwa or the Osage or the Lakota or the Comanche, and the US had to be wary of the power of Spain, later Mexico, and especially of Britain to the north. The size of the United States Army before 1850 was, except for the period of the War of 1812 and the brief period of the US-Mexico War, the size of the army was never more than about 7,000 men, and there was a huge desertion rate. A post commander in what's now Minnesota had to rely on local indigenous people to round up deserters and bring them back. That is not a power that can impose itself on the frontier. So most historians, though, will tell you that the United States was the surpassing power in North America, and eventually, by the end of the 19th century, this is true. But in the first half of the 19th century, the situation was much more complex, and to my mind, more interesting. Sometimes the United States could assert itself vertically, imposing its power in places in the West. But most of the time, the US didn't have that power, and so it had to move horizontally into the West, use diplomatic suasion, either with Britain or with Mexico or with indigenous people. And so when you look at the whole picture, what you have is the United States angling into the West in diagonals, not simply imposing itself from above. So the second point I want to make here is that the United States was divided about what to do about the West in this period. First of all, the United States is divided, period. Was the U.S. going to be slaveholding or emancipationist? Was it going to be pious or free-thinking, agrarian or market-oriented? And it is not as if Americans put aside those differences when they looked to the West. In a lot of ways, actually, they played out those disagreements when they went to the frontier. There were advocates for conquest and advocates for missionary activity, and also, as I wrote about in my book, providing the smallpox vaccine to indigenous people so that they wouldn't die. So in the first half of the 19th century, U.S. territorial expansion was not a consensus. In 1819, Andrew Jackson, who had just invaded Spanish Florida and executed a couple captured British civilians, was very nearly censured by the House of Representatives. In 1830, Jackson's Indian Removal Act only barely passed the House. Beginning in 1836, continuing for the next 10 years or so, 9 years, there was a group of people in Congress who stymied the admission of Texas to the Union. So the idea of dispossessing Native people and of expanding the boundaries of the United States was not quite the consensus that historians make it out to be. And here's where I agree with Nick, is that slavery was one of the biggest sources of disagreement. The biggest advocates of expansion, especially expansion into Florida and Texas, were slaveholders. Anti-slavery advocates were the biggest opponents of expansion. In fact, what historians rather loosely call Western expansion should, I think, properly be called Southern expansion for the first half of the 19th century. The U.S. acquired Louisiana in 1803, but the purpose of that purchase was to acquire New Orleans. The rest of that territory was tacked on, and the extent of that territory, its boundaries, weren't determined until early in the 1820s. The first 3 states to be admitted from Louisiana, from the territory, were Louisiana, Arkansas, and Missouri, all admitted as slave states. Those are the only states admitted before the U.S.-Mexico War. All the territory the United States acquired in the first half of the 19th century, first West Florida, then East Florida, then Texas, were all acquired for the expansion of slavery. The election of Polk, the president who brought on the U.S.-Mexico War, wasn't a consensus about expansion. It was only made possible because a third-party candidate in the state of New York drew enough votes away from Polk's opponent, who was moderately anti-slavery, so that Polk was able to win. The third thing I want to leave you with. These divisions were partisan. When Democrats under Andrew Jackson and later Polk pushed for expansion, they were not tapping into a set of widely shared American beliefs. By the time he ran for president, Jackson had already been the subject of many narratives that made him famous. And he was famous as the person who had slaughtered indigenous people and defeated the British and attacked the Spanish. Jackson's opponents depicted him as a murderer. This idea of expansion was not a partisan consensus. They depicted him as a murderer. They used his own reports to depict him as such. And the reason why this is confusing, I think, for a lot of people, particularly for a lot of historians, is that one of Jackson's political opponents, William Henry Harrison, was also touted by his supporters as a murderer of indigenous people and someone who had expanded the frontier. On the surface, this would make it seem like this is a political consensus that both parties are tapping into. I would just remind you that in this election year, for instance, all of the candidates for national office are talking about how much they love their guns. And clearly only one of those parties, one would think that this is not exactly what most of the people who would vote for them were thinking. So when politicians talk about things, I think we need to regard it, we need to look at it through a partisan lens. And we've not really done that for narratives about the frontier. We just assume that everyone was in agreement about this, and I don't think that was the case. I think the most notable example of this is the idea of manifest destiny. This has been treated by historians as a consensus, and it was the opposite. It was an idea that was put forward in 1846 1906 by a partisan newspaper editor, John O'Sullivan. It might go too far to call him the Tucker Carlson or the Rachel Maddow of his day, but it really wouldn't go too far. That's kind of what he was. He wrote his editorial at a time when the United States was awaiting a reply from Texas about whether Texas would accept their offer of admission to the Union. It was a very close thing. The Senate had only voted to offer this admission by one vote. And so O'Sullivan was very concerned that this might not happen. It was clearly a partisan appeal. Most historians at the time thought about the frontier this way. If you look at histories that are written in the 19th century, they treated this not as a consensus, but as actually a matter of partisan debate. It was only around the year 1900 when historians, at the time when the United States was emerging as an empire, historians went back and appointed or anointed manifest destiny as a consensus. They made it into a thing that no one at the time thought it was. So I guess the point I want to leave you with is that we know now that we live in divided political times, and we should try to think about the middle of the 19th century and the first half of the 19th century when politicians are thinking about the West as equally divided. Thanks.
Working? I also have notes. First, I want to say thank you to Cecily and Andy and Jeff. And I know that this is our 19th century session, but I do want to start off by talking about 2015, just very briefly. So in 2015, Barack Obama became the first sitting president to visit a US federal prison. And this fact tends to surprise a lot of people, not because they're necessarily surprised that President Obama visited a federal prison, but that it took so long for any sitting president to do so. And to be clear, past presidents have taken an interest in prisons as governors and as private citizens. They've written about prisons, they've written about prison reform and about punishment. But for much of the 19th century, there was no federal prison system. There were no federal prisons until the end of the 19th century. And so what I want to talk about today is how we got to the point of having a federal prison system and why the frontier was so crucial to that. For much of the 19th century, prisons and jails were a matter of local and state authority. There was no sweeping presidential policy. Congress was not really involved in the beginning. I'll get to when they got involved. It was really about what was going on in individual cities. And we see this reflected in the records of debates about different prison systems, the Pennsylvania versus the Auburn system, different prison reform societies. It all tends to be very local and very state-focused. But prisons became a federal issue with the expansion of the United States into new territory, because as the US claimed new territory, there was a desire and a perceived need for prisons in these spaces. And so this left Congress with the task of approving funds for the construction and management of prisons in US territories, which was something new, because up until that point, this was under the purview of state governors, and again, state authority. Thus, the frontier allowed for the federal government to take a new role in developing the prison system in the United States. And in my paper, I argue that the frontier offered a new means of expanding this aspect of the carceral system. And this expansion was crucial to the process of expanding US power, even in the absence of a federal prison system. Now, by the time the US Congress passed the Three Prisons Act of 1891, which established the first 3 federal prisons in the United States, the US had already undergone decades of debate about prisons and prison reform. But most of this had been focused on eastern states. A lot of these debates centered on Pennsylvania, on Massachusetts, on New York, but the US was pushing west. And as the US expanded, new prisons were being built. So this process involved the federal government and involved federal intervention quite directly. For example, in 1867, Congress approved the Territory of Colorado's request for $40,000 to build a new penitentiary in the territory. It took several years. It did not open until 1871. But this project was overseen by a U.S. Marshal, and then they had an Army officer serve as the first head of the penitentiary, which is a stark contrast to how prisons were set up, again, in eastern states, where that wasn't really the process. It was not U.S. Marshals in charge of things. It was state governors and state legislatures appointing wardens and keepers to prisons. And so we can see how the federal government took a more active role in developing prisons as the U.S. continued to expand. And this continued as the U.S. pushed further west. And I want to have us look in particular at McNeil Island Penitentiary. So if you have not heard of McNeil Island, that's okay. Coming from the University of Washington, I am going to highlight a prison that is in Washington. Located on McNeil Island, it is a remote island off the coast of Tacoma, Washington. And McNeil Penitentiary was developed at the edge of the American frontier in 1875. Once again, this was approved by Congress, the funding and management, all approved by Congress, for a Washington Territory prison before it was a federal prison. And even before it had a federal prison sort of designation, the federal government immediately used the penitentiary as a means of enforcing federal immigration policy, particularly the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Now, the Chinese Exclusion Act did not actually specify any specific punishment for unauthorized presence in the territory and in the US, but immediately federal courts would impose sentences, often 6-month sentences, on Chinese immigrants and individuals for being unlawfully present in the country. By the late 1880s, imprisoning Chinese immigrants for illegal presence in the US had become pretty routine. These people were often sentenced to hard labor at McNeil before deportation. Now, I'd be happy to talk about this a lot longer, but I want to be mindful of our 5-minute time. So I just want to conclude by noting that McNeil Penitentiary became a federal prison in 1891, one of the first 3 federal prisons in the United States. But it had already served as a tool for the federal government for many years before this designation. Congress funded the prison, and then federal courts used the prison to enforce restrictive federal immigration policy. Federal use of McNeil and other prisons on the frontier didn't begin with the 3 Prisons Act, and it didn't begin with the creation of the federal prison system. It began with the development of prisons in territories on the American frontier.
I did not bring notes, so. Thanks all for being here. I really appreciate it. I'm so grateful to all of the panelists who said yes to our invitation, a true mark of the Clements Center and the CPH and their sort of the collective interest they inspire in these topics. And thank you all for being here to hear about them. So I was given the perhaps unenviable task of writing an essay about the Civil War, which we all know, as a conflict between North and South. So you'd very likely be asking yourself, where's the West in this? And that's a great question. Many of you probably know increasingly historians are interested in this question. They're interested in the ways in which the American West was incorporated into the Civil War and into the Civil War generations thinking about the future of the country. We all know the war was brought on by the West. We of course know this. It was whether or not slavery would expand into the West that forms the sort of crux of the question of why the South secedes. They think Lincoln is going to stop slavery from expanding. That is enough of an existential threat to the 11 states of the American South who leave the Union to do so. And they do, and then they wage a 4-year war to attempt to make that secession constitutional. The war, of course, also gave the opportunity for the federal government, the Union government, in the absence of southern states who had long resisted infrastructural developments that would have made the American West a haven for free labor's expansion, to do so. And so they passed the Pacific Railroad Act and the Homestead Act and the Morrill Land Grant Act, policies that exemplify the Republican Party's free labor vision for the American West. And if the Union wins the war, this is, of course, the vision that wins, and it does. And we know the story sort of thereafter. But what about in those crucial years between 1861 and 1865, when the 16,000-man regular army, which is all that it had gotten to since Drew's period, they didn't increase it that much. I'll tell you this, they didn't like the army, so they kept it pretty small. Those 16,000 men in garrisons spread across the frontier are withdrawn. They're taken back to the east to fight the Civil War. There are perhaps some temporary militias put in their place. You have a vacuum of authority in the West, one that really the federal government had tenuously upheld with this tiny federal army. And so what happens is you see an outburst of violence along the frontier as indigenous people see this moment as an opportunity to reassert their power and their claims to sovereignty in the absence of federal authority. And the most famous case of this is perhaps in Minnesota, in what becomes known as the Dakota War of 1862, which historians are increasingly advocating calling the U.S. Dakota War of 1862, giving the United States impetus as the aggressors in this conflict. The Dakota Uprising, as settlers at the time called it, or the Dakota Massacre, which those in Minnesota, the white settlers in Minnesota referred to the event as, resulted in the deaths of about 500 white civilians along the Minnesota, what is now the Minnesota-North Dakota border. The deaths of about 150 Dakota warriors. It involved the participation of about 1,500 Dakota, as far as we can tell. It lasted 5 weeks. There was a series of raids, burning of townships, and finally, once the Minnesota militia got its act together, because they didn't have any federal troops, they'd all been sent east to fight in the Civil War, we get what you all probably have heard of as the largest mass hanging in American history. So over 300 Dakota are sentenced for their participation in the massacre. They are sentenced to be hanged. Abraham Lincoln, and here comes the presidency, personally pores over that list, and he commutes the sentences of all but 38 of the Dakota, who are then hanged at the end of December 1862. And for most historians, that's where the story of the Dakota War ends. It ends in the hanging of the 38 Dakota at Mankato, and we think that Lincoln probably then refocused his attention on events in the East. If you'll remember, the first day of 1863, he's doing something pretty important in American history. He's issuing that little Proclamation of Emancipation that made a big difference in the Union War effort. So we tend to think he didn't really focus on the West at all, but it remained a matter of importance because not all of the Dakota who had participated in the uprising were captured or sentenced in the aftermath of the war. Many of them had used a strategy that indigenous people have used across the history of the American West. They'd crossed the border into Canada and sought refuge in the Canadian provinces, which were then British territory, though not long to be British territory. Canadian Confederation came shortly after the Civil War. And the United States had no authority to go get them. But what my paper is about in this volume is the extent to which they tried, and the extent to which the rigidity of an international border in the American West caused a massive headache for Abraham Lincoln in the midst of a civil war. Because Abraham Lincoln did not want the United States Army, which he did eventually have to send back out to Minnesota to deal with the ongoing Dakota crisis, to be crossing the border into British territory and potentially opening another front of the Civil War, and not just one between rebel and Union, but between the United States and Great Britain, a country whose recognition the Confederacy was hoping to achieve so that it would have international legitimacy and a trading partner for all that Confederate cotton, which could no longer get through the Union blockade. And so you have this really interesting moment of Lincoln negotiating an international crisis spurred on by indigenous affairs in the American West. And Lincoln has a really hard time with it. I mean, the bottom line for him is we are not invading Canada. There's no way that we are invading Canada, though eventually Army officers on the ground and the territorial governor of Rupert's Land in Canada, Hudson's Bay Company colony, agree to allow U.S. forces to cross the border. It doesn't come off. Those of you who've been to Minnesota or North Dakota know it tends to be kind of cold and icy. They couldn't get across the river to get up into British territory, foiled by the weather. But it's just this really interesting kind of moment of crisis. And so the Civil War West, in really surprising ways, of course it brings to mind indigenous issues, and it portends to that. But it also brings to mind questions of borders and boundaries, and the ways in which sort of international affairs played significantly into Lincoln's thinking about the region. And so that's what my paper kind of looks at, is Lincoln trying to manage these dual crises. But I think by suggesting that Lincoln didn't think about these things, we do a disservice to the kind of full tapestry of the story of the American Civil War, and why pulling these Western stories in is so important. Lincoln could not avoid thinking about them. And in his 4th annual message to Congress, he talks more about foreign affairs and indigenous affairs than he does about the Civil War at all. So when we read the sources and look at the documents, it's clear that the West is all over the Civil War, not just in its causes and consequences, but in its conduct as well. Thank you.
Hello. I'd like to echo my panelists' thanks to Rana, Andy, Jeff, and Cecily for organizing this. I work at a small liberal arts college, and so to have the opportunity to present this kind of a venue is really, really exciting for me. I want to just start with a quick discussion of positionality and scholarship. As Andy kindly pointed out, I am a scholar of U.S. history, but I do engage with and in many ways rely on the work of Native Hawaiian scholars. And so when I frame my work, I think it's just important to acknowledge my indebtedness to Native Hawaiian scholars for the production of knowledge that they do, for the translation work, and for the abundance of Hawaiian language sources that they have produced that I am the beneficiary of, excuse me. The second thing I would start our discussion with is the year of 1893. When I was in grad school, I jokingly said I was going to write a book on the year 1893. It is a very important year in U.S. history and in U.S. historiography. It was the year of the Chicago World's Fair, Columbian Exposition, more commonly known as the Chicago World's Fair. It was the year that Colorado passed the right to women's suffrage, the first state to pass women's suffrage. It was the year of an economic crisis that would plague the rest of the 1890s, and particularly the administration of Grover Cleveland. It was also, interestingly, I found out, the year that the Supreme Court declared that the tomato was officially a vegetable, or counted as a vegetable. For this project, no tomatoes involved. For this project, 1893 is incredibly significant because it was the year that Queen Liliuokalani was overthrown by United States Marines and Hawaiian, some Hawaiian-born but of American descent businessmen. It was also the same year that Frederick Jackson Turner delivered his famous frontier thesis to the American Historical Association. And finally, it was also the year that Grover Cleveland was inaugurated for the second time as President of the United States. And so my work in this essay really looks at the intersection of these three events of 1893. The first and foremost question that I grapple with in this paper is how and whether or not we could even consider Hawaii as part of the frontier. In the imagining of Frederick Jackson Turner, his contemporaries, and others, I think there is some cause to say that it was an imagined frontier. It was ideologically understood as this space of conquest, a space in which Native Hawaiians needed to be civilized, and that Americans in particular were the people to do it. In terms of the actual experience on the ground in Hawaii, I'm not so sure that there is an actual frontier there. I don't know if it would be at the shoreline or where here, but when we're all talking about the West, capital W West, I don't really necessarily know if that applies to the Pacific and the Hawaiian Islands. And so my West, we're going really, really far west, is the lowercase w West in this case, the directional West. And so in grappling with this question about Hawaii as a frontier, particularly at this moment in the 1890s, right? The 1890 census is what causes Turner to be so anxious about the closing of the frontier. And there's this question about whether or not what the future of American values and culture will look like in his imagining. And there's this kind of assumption that as soon as we reached the West Coast, the California coast, we just kept going into the Pacific. And I think that story is actually much more complicated. And that is, I think, maybe where I am a little bit uncomfortable in thinking of Hawaii as an actual frontier. And in thinking about this same exact timeline, I also just want to assert in my work and in my paper that the annexation of Hawaii and its ongoing continued occupation by the United States was not inevitable. It was an illegal act, and it could not have been achieved without the ongoing threat of colonial violence, and also the actual lingering threat of bloodshed. It's really only to protect the already devastated Native Hawaiian population. Native Hawaiian population was essentially decimated by disease. Island peoples were particularly vulnerable and had less ability to relocate, to grapple with these questions. And so by the time Queen Liliuokalani ascended the throne in 1891, she was invested in reasserting Hawaiian authority, but she was not willing to sacrifice her people. Which brings me to my second kind of major point that I want to make in my paper. And that is that Queen Liliuokalani should be recognized for her incredibly important work as an international figure and as a stateswoman. She was critical in asserting Hawaiian autonomy, even after she was arrested and placed on house arrest following the overthrow, the coup. She continued to advocate for the restoration of Hawaiian authority. She appealed personally to Grover Cleveland, a man she had met during his first presidency. She remarked kindly on his very, very young wife. And when she was on her way with a delegation of Hawaiian diplomats to Queen Victoria's Jubilee celebration. And so it is through these relationships that she begins to kind of navigate not only her own survival, particularly the survival of the lands that were owned by the Hawaiian monarchy, but also the survival of the Hawaiian people. Her publication of her autobiography in 1898 was both an act of documenting Hawaiian history and also an act of an assertion of Hawaiian nationalism. Her brother and predecessor, King Kalakaua, had done a lot of work to kind of revive traditional elements of Hawaiian culture. For example, the practice of hula had been outlawed under the missionaries in particular. Hula, of course, was a sacred dance. It was not a spectator performance for white audiences, and coconut bras had nothing to do with it. So he was incredibly important in asserting Hawaiian cultural values, the Hawaiian language, but he often, I think, lacked the same political mind and the political acuity that his sister Liliuokalani did have. And so the second kind of point that I really want to make is just that she was incredibly important, not only for the Hawaiian people, but also in this broader stage, the broader world stage, and navigating kind of geopolitical affairs. And then the final thing that I'm kind of grappling with in my essay, in thinking about her negotiations with first Grover Cleveland and then William McKinley, things do not go as well under William McKinley. Grover Cleveland had expressed a significant amount of support for the Hawaiian cause and did declare the overthrow as an illegal act of war. But he was not able to kind of halt for the long term or undo the work that imperialism had been doing on the ground for the previous decades. And so where I'm kind of ending my essay is in grappling with this question about the limits of the presidency in halting or stopping American expansionism. I think, as recent events will demonstrate to us, it's quite easy for the executive branch, and as many of our scholars have shown in the early 19th century, the frontier, the rhetoric of the frontier, the image of the frontier were critical tools of political candidates and of presidents. But I'm not so sure, back to the war, I was going to say, it's fairly easy to start wars, it's really hard to get out of them, as recent events have shown. And I think that same idea and ideology is true of American expansionism and American imperialism. And so I end kind of with this question about whether or not Hawaii is American. There's this source that I came across during my dissertation research. It was published in 1922, so about 2 decades, a little over 2 decades after the US annexed Hawaii in 1898. And it was published by the Sugar Planters Association. And they stated, Hawaii, it opens with the statement, Hawaii has always been American. No, it wasn't. It still really isn't. But I think this assertion about how do we include Hawaii in the history of the United States, how do we talk about and insert Hawaii in the history of the United States, my goal is to always make people think about Hawaii, put it on every syllabus I can. So how do we include it in this conversation, this important conversation about US empire and American imperialism, but how do we also recognize that it should not be American at the same time? And so that is where I will end my talk, and I really appreciate all of your time.
Okay, I think that is plenty of grist for the conversational mill. So in my best Bob Barker voice, come on down. Come down. Unlike on an airplane, you can actually gather in the gangway. So come ask questions of them. You do not want me asking all the questions. So please, floor is yours.
Please save us from Andy.
Exciting. Thank you all. Those were all really fascinating. I really appreciate it, and I know we're going to have a wonderful workshop tomorrow. Mallory, I was hoping you could just say a little bit more about this concept that Hawaii is not American, and juxtapose that against the idea that what other areas within the West, within Frederick Jackson Turner's concept of frontier, within expansion, would be American in a sense. Like, why is there a distinction to be made aside from some water?
So in thinking about much of the West, I would say first, a lot of that shouldn't be American in the United States context as well, of course. I think this kind of goes back to this question that my grad school advisor, Lori Ginsberg, asked me. She said, well, what about Puerto Rico? And thinking about why is Hawaii this weird special case? How does Hawaii become a state? As much of the West, the American West did. And how does that contrast to other overseas territories? Because Hawaii is kind of this exception. There are, of course, US territories that have a voice in US politics, but statehood is kind of this bizarre double-edged sword for Hawaii and for the Hawaiian people, partially because a lot of Native Hawaiians actually were opposed to statehood. Of course, they were opposed to annexation. Women, some of the most ardent opposition leaders against annexation. But there was this idea, under the 14th Amendment, going back to Civil War and Reconstruction, that equal protection under the law could be beneficial to peoples in overseas territories. Colonies, we should call them, and there is truth to that. Scholars of the 19th century laud the 14th Amendment and what it meant for the 4 million emancipated African Americans, but it also meant for Hawaiians further dispossession from the land and further loss of political power because of the Equal Protection Clause in many cases, because anyone can buy land in Hawaii. Whereas other Pacific Island territories, such as Samoa, for example, there are restrictions about who can purchase land. You have to have a certain amount of Samoan heritage, which is entangled in all these complicated colonial blood quantum issues. But what it did do is it preserved the land for Samoans, and so I think Hawaii has some similar elements of what was taking place in the West with regards to the settlement of the West, settler colonialism in certain cases, a word that I know can be a bit complicated. But there is this way in which Hawaii is both kind of the exception and also fulfills that same history in that over time, the territories were eventually incorporated as states. The states that, or the territories that generally had the most non-white peoples generally had a much longer path to statehood, right? That's why Oklahoma has a very long path to statehood. And so there is something, I think, about the fact that Hawaii was and remains a place where white people are the minority that both complicates and adds to this conversation about Western expansion and statehood and settlement. So that was a very long, meandering answer that I'm not even sure answered the actual question, but you're making me think, and I really appreciate that.
I have a question for Nick, but also I'm just going to call a small audible, and I'm happy to bring the microphone to you if that is a little more comfortable for you. But I'm going to ask my question, and then I'll do that. I was really struck by your note about Thomas Jefferson thinking about the West as Virginia writ large. Could you talk? I've just never heard that before, but it doesn't surprise me once you say it. So I guess my question is, can you talk a little bit more about that? Is this something he's writing about? Is this a rhetoric thing that he's speaking about in this way? Or is this something you're reading in as you work through his material?
Yeah, thanks very much for that question. First, I just want to say to everyone, I'm so sorry you have to come up. I mean, sending the microphone around sounds like a much. Nobody comes to one of these things being, expecting to participate. But your questions would still be very much appreciated. Yeah, I mean, Jefferson is not the only one. There's a really good book by a guy called Bruce Ragsdale, which is called Washington at the Plow. And I know that sounds really boring, but actually it's a fantastic book about like Washington as a political thinker and especially as an enslaver, which talks about his vision of farming. And here's the weird thing about Washington. He had lots of modern ideas about how to create big farms in Virginia. They didn't involve slavery. So Washington's hope was that you would be able to graduate to a space where you would have large tenant farms, but they'd be white people, not black people, and they'd be working them not in slavery. But hey, he got these ideas from England. So us English, we love a bit of hierarchy. So these tenant farmers are basically going to be kind of very lower class people. And that's the vision, right? That these guys are not really going to be equal to you as the farmer. So in a strange way, Washington and a bunch of other people who are thinking about first Western Virginia and then further afield in terms of thinking about farming, trying to graduate from the old crop of tobacco to new crops like wheat. They have this kind of plan for doing it, and it doesn't involve enslaved people, but it involves a kind of vertical, like, hierarchy of white people. So they're getting all these lovely letters from their friends in England saying, hey, just get peasants. Peasants are awesome. And then, especially as you get after the revolution, it's like, yeah, we kind of aren't supposed to have peasants anymore. So I know this is not a very big insight for many of you, but actually all men are created equal is a massive problem. Because all men are created equal suggests that what you're going to do is have a horizontal society, and that many of these ideas that these Virginians are beginning to get about how the West might be farmed with hierarchies of white people are not going to fly. So yeah, Jefferson talks about this stuff a lot. Again, if you know him at all, you'll know that during the American Revolution, he becomes intensely frustrated by the fact that the only time he isn't really in Virginia, they actually draft the Constitution. So the state constitution happens when he's like out of town. And like when he gets back after he's written the Declaration of Independence, he's like, oh no, this Constitution is terrible. And then spends the rest of the Revolution trying to work out how to fix it. And what he doesn't like about the Constitution is that he thinks it's too hierarchical and gives too much power to the old enslavers, so the kind of landed, moneyed enslavers of the Tidewater. So he's always thinking about ways that he can try and undo that. But here's the weird thing about him, and we don't talk about this enough. It's so bizarre to me that Jefferson's vision for Virginia, but also for the West beyond Virginia, is that you'll find ways to include indigenous people. That's hard in Virginia because that story is almost over already by the 1770s. But more broadly in the West, you include indigenous people and you remove black people. How bizarre is it that what actually ends up happening is that you include black people, albeit as enslaved people, and then you remove indigenous people? And in a way, the fact that there's a complete 180 in the outcome versus Jefferson's plan tells you a lot about either the emptiness or the shakiness of a lot of ideas that the founders had about both slavery and about Native Americans. And we need to talk about this more. Jefferson's actually, at the end of his life, kind of okay with this. He blames the fact that Native Americans have been removed on the British, mostly, which is not completely fair in my view. But he's like, if it weren't for the lousy, pesky British, Native Americans would have rushed to us. That was never true. And we're going to talk a bit more about this in tomorrow's presentation, so come back for those. His views about Indians are so fixed and so unhelpful. So that's part of the kind of problem, or part of the challenge around what ends up happening. But I think he doesn't get out a lot. Apart from France, he really doesn't. And I think that makes a difference. Had he actually spent time in the West, we might have seen a very different vision.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all so much for your presentations. My question is for all of you. And I will say I'm someone that is presenting tomorrow and is firmly a 20th century historian. And I had the benefit of going to graduate school and spending time with many borderlands and 19th century historians. And one of the elements of the 19th century that's always struck me as a 20th century historian is that federal power looks so different. And as a historian of U.S. foreign relations, we all have to reckon with what American power becomes after the Second World War and what it becomes in the Cold War and what it becomes after. And I'd love for each of you to talk about directly, as I know it's a major frame for the volume, of how does your story change the way that we think about federal power, and what does it mean for scholars to have to reckon with these new visions of federal power when you bring in the frontier?
Yeah, great question. Jealous that my colleagues have a little more time to work through it. So one of the things that I think is interesting about the time period, so normally I'm just gonna be perfectly clear. I don't like to study the presidents. I've made a real goal of avoiding them. They just weasel their way in there though. But I do think, especially when we think about US imperialism and the transition to the 20th century, I think we pay so much attention to Teddy Roosevelt with good reason. And so I think that in thinking about federal power in the late 19th century, in the context of Hawaii, I think that my biggest thought is in this idea that it wasn't particularly powerful on the ground, as many have discussed, but I think that there's a way in which it legitimized imperialism on the ground. And so, for example, in 1893, I mean, it was the U.S. foreign minister was aware and supported the invasion, essentially, of Iolani Palace, and sent U.S. Marines from Honolulu Harbor on shore as a demonstration of U.S. support, which I know we've been talking a lot about how the military wasn't that big and that powerful, but I think its interconnectedness with American trade and commerce, particularly at sea, but also I think in the West as well, is incredibly important in grappling with this question of federal power in the frontier. I bet my colleagues have better answers though, so I'm gonna pass it along.
I think it's great. I think one thing we have to keep in mind with the 19th century is that these are still generations close enough to the founding to have some investment in the preservation of checks and balances. And there is a great fear of the unwieldy executive, or the executive with too much authority. And so one thing Lincoln faces throughout the war is a great deal of pushback. Like, when he issues executive proclamations, like the Emancipation Proclamation, this is one of the first kind of instances in American history where we get a president really sort of stretching the definition of what the executive can do. But when it comes to the territories, of course, the federal government, again, divided authority administration. They have to work these things out. But I think one thing to keep in our minds is 19th century Americans were not as uncomfortable with rampant presidential power or the sort of giving presidents a long leash on which to kind of do whatever they wanted to do. They were very invested in institutions like Congress and the Supreme Court checking the president. I mean, we talk about Andrew Jackson and Indian removal, right? Like, Justice Marshall has made his decision, let us see him enforce it. I mean, Jackson is kind of the first president perhaps to challenge this. Lincoln has to. It's a crisis, it's a crucible of conflict in the Civil War. But he doesn't do it without significant kind of intervention. And so one really interesting question, I think, with the 19th century and the executive is, sometimes we see a real absence of federal power and federal authority, but I think that's due in part to the degree to which 19th century Americans still believed that the government established by the founders should work almost on the kind of way that they suggested it should, which is be that no one branch can exert more power than any other. So that's what I would add.
Yeah, thank you so much for this question. I will note that, when carceral studies scholars talk about the 19th century, when we talk about a carceral system in the US, we're talking about two different systems. We have the system of slavery as a carceral system, and then we have prisons and jails as a carceral system. And so from the start, the US federal government is obviously involved in the system of slavery. It is less involved in the development of prisons because it is a local and state issue. And part of that is because a lot of the early thoughts on jails and prisons are coming from, well, people we would consider founding fathers and some presidents, though not in their capacity as president. But also a lot of it is in direct reaction to English penal codes. And so there are small pockets of thinkers and legislatures working on reacting to Enlightenment thinkers, reacting to British penal codes, and thinking through what can we do to make the US different, and a bunch of different ideas come out of that. And as I said, it's very localized, it's very much state by state in the beginning. And the federal government's pretty okay with that. They're fine with it being an issue of the states. They're fine with it being kind of up to the parties in different states. Some presidents do weigh in. In 1828, Madison weighs in on the debate of the Pennsylvania system versus the Auburn system and throws his weight behind the Auburn system, which was kind of the popular opinion. The Auburn system does win out. But he did that as a private citizen at that point. It was in a letter, in a discussion about prison reform. Where we see the federal government really step in with the development of prisons is, as I said, in newer US territories. And it's really reactionary. Part of it is that there is crime happening in these territories, but also there's a perception that prisons are needed in spaces where the US is and will be in order to enforce US laws. So sometimes these things start off as frontier jails, which are different from prisons, and we can talk about that if you'd like. But the idea of having a penitentiary, a prison, an official space, an institution like that is really important in this development. And because it becomes a federal issue, it gives them a way into developing this prison system because they get to approve the funds, they get to talk about management, they get to really have a say in what particular marshals, what they can do, have a little more say in who's in charge of things, though in charge and in control is loosely defined here. But I think in particular, as I said, when we get further and further west and as we get to the development of the federal prison system, the first step is in the end of the 19th century. That's a huge step because up until that point, there was no system. And really, even with the first 3 Prisons Act, it's just 3 prisons. It's Leavenworth, Atlanta, and McNeil Island. We don't get a real bureau or any system to go along with those 3 prisons until the 20th century. So it's really their first formal attempt to have a federal prison system, but it's enabled by the frontier. And I don't know if it would have happened without the frontier offering that opportunity because states were so invested in controlling prisons. It got very messy with party politics, Whigs and Democrats fighting over wardens, very, very messy. And so the frontier was really an opportunity for the federal government to be involved in the development of prisons.
it's kind of like Richard White, the historian, said that the West is the kindergarten of the American state. I think federal prisons really fit into that kind of ideology.
So my sense is that we should expect that the power of the federal state and the power of the federal state in the West would change over the course of the 19th century. That, you know, if you look at this panel, we're going from, you know, the late 18th century to the late 19th century, and what we're thinking of as the West is also changing. It's Western Virginia and maybe Ohio and Kentucky and Hawaii at another end of the spectrum. And so there's a couple of things that can maybe help make sense of this. One of them is, as was just said a moment ago, the federal government in the first half of the 19th century is abetting slavery and supporting the expansion of slavery, and slaveholders are at the leading edge of expansion. And in the second half of the 19th century, the United States has become an industrial state, and the federal government is very supportive of industrialization, and industrialists are at the leading edge of expansion. So the kind of thing that Nick was talking about in Virginia in the late 18th and early 19th century, that's why it's so different from the story of Hawaii at the end of the 19th century. Yeah, maybe I'll just leave it at that.
This is going to strike you as being a facetious comment. It's not meant as one. I mean, the first manifestation of executive power on the frontier in North America is King of England, right? And this is the weird part for the revolutionaries, for the founders. Like, what the king did, or what was done by his, privy councillors and by the folks in the executive over in London, was basically to say, you're not going to be able to cross this line, which was drawn arbitrarily up the mountains in 1763, or that all treaty making is going to be done by the king, by the representatives of the crown. And Americans are furious about this. This is actually one of the engines of the American Revolution, especially in the western part of the colonies, although even for some Easterners too that want to monopolize this trade and actually want to go off and settle some of these areas or support settlement there. So then when the American Revolution happens, it's like, who is going to manage this frontier? And interestingly, Jefferson, in his 1784 draft of what becomes the Northwest Ordinance, has a much more kind of grassroots, devolved, folks in these new territories should be much more empowered from an early stage. Lots of that gets drained away from the final draft of the Northwest Ordinance in 1787, which again, a bit like the Virginia Constitution, is written when Jefferson's out of town. Jefferson's in Paris at that point. But I think it's really interesting to think about the fact that Jefferson's vision was less federally centered. I mean, of course, the Northwest Ordinance is just before the Constitution, but as it gets adapted by the new federal government, it really concentrates federal power. And again, for any civilians here, what I mean by that is before you end up in a position where you have a state, you have several phases of territorial government, the first two of which involve really considerable executive power. So if I can put it in crude terms, if Jefferson picks William Henry Harrison to go to Indiana Territory, then in the first phase, he's basically like a dictator. He has huge power. And in the second phase, where he has kind of council of advisors, he's still super powerful. So this is a really direct projection of executive power. And here's the weird thing. Maybe this is to kind of just try and, for the sake of keeping everyone entertained, begin a little fight between me and Drew. In relation to consensus, you might think, if you follow Jefferson carefully through the 1790s, that when he got the keys to the White House, he would be adamant that all of that federal power, which has already been expressed in the West, there's a huge war in the Northwest in the late 1780s and early 1790s, all that will be done away with. Instead, when Jefferson enters the White House, as it then is, he pursues, persists with, continues many of the basic tenets of the Federalists' Indian policy. And I can tell you one reason he does it. He does it because there's a huge fear in the first decades of the United States that if you do not create a government which will recognize the needs of these settlers, then those people will go somewhere else. They'll go to Spain, or they'll try and get Britain back in, or they'll maybe try and get France back in. So this sense, in a way, that settlement is a fact, and that what you need is a government that's clever enough and flexible enough to make sure those settlers stay loyal to that government. That's a lot of what's going on here. But the coda to this is that when he starts telling William Henry Harrison up in Indiana to get more aggressive treaty making with Native Americans, one of the things he does is say, get them to come into the shop and give them a lot of credit. Because if you give them credit, then once they can't pay it back, then we can take their land. I mean, it's genuinely like the stuff that you might see now as predatory lending. He's doing that with native people. And then Harrison says, actually, we don't need that much land right now for settlers. And Jefferson says, do it anyway. And the reason Jefferson does that is because this idea of land is central to his political idea, which is for a decentralized republic. But the only way to secure it is through that federal power. So again, that's the kind of irony of Jefferson's handling of all of this. But the 1800s look more like the 1790s than you might expect.
All right, may I? I'm going to say, first of all, you really are leaning into the Englishness a little, maybe too much. Blimey, cup of tea, mate. Yeah. So, all right, I'll just say, first of all, I think that one of the things I think I would like people to do when they think about the power of the state in the West is to take indigenous agency and autonomy and power seriously. That there are many things that the state imagined it could do that they couldn't actually affect on the ground. And that in the late 18th and early 19th century became truer and truer the farther west you moved. So partisans of the US state was born powerful. When they're looking at the West, they tend to focus their attention on the very easternmost part of the West, where the United States could do some kinds of things. And I think another thing that happens when we imagine that the US state was fairly powerful in the beginning of the 19th century is that some historians will look into the mind of Jefferson, and there's this kind of sense that all Jefferson needed to do was think it, and it would become so. And Jefferson mused about many, many things, and what was actually happening on the ground was a very, very different thing. I'll give you one example, and it's another policy that Jefferson continued from the Federalists, and that was a policy of subsidizing trade with Native people. And Jefferson mused in a letter to William Henry Harrison, when we see them run into debt, then they will cede us this land because they have to forgive this debt. And in fact, on the ground, this subsidized trade system didn't function that way at all. In fact, federal traders were forbidden to sell things on credit, so there was no debt involved. It was actually a handout, a gift, a diplomatic gesture toward Native people to try to win their goodwill. So Jefferson mused about a lot of things, and in a lot of his musings, the federal government was very powerful. On the ground, it was a very different story.
I'm going to stay quiet till tomorrow.
The signal to have one more question here, but I'm sure that we can have a little more discussion after.
Certainly, I didn't mean to have the last question. When I think about the frontier in the American presidency in the 19th century, I automatically think of the territorial system. And I'm really curious about something that you said, Andrew, which was that there was no consensus on territorial expansion at mid-century. And yet in the 1850s, we have 5 territories organized by Congress, which was the most in that kind of within a 5-year period. That was the most that were organized since the early part of the 19th century. And of course, those territories that were created in the 1850s had significant impacts on the presidencies of Pierce and Buchanan. So I was wondering if you could reflect on that, the idea of consensus and the oddity of this organization, as well as the ways in which those territories impacted the presidency.
Yeah, so it seems when you get to the US-Mexico War that everything changes dramatically. That even if the election of Polk was a very closely contested thing, all of a sudden, as soon as that war begins and the United States acquires, steals a big chunk of northern Mexico, that the dam has broken and now there must be some sort of consensus about expansion. And New Mexico and Kansas and Nebraska and eventually other territories are formed out of this. And some of them, Kansas and Nebraska, had already been nominally a US possession. But at the same time, Polk and people in his administration wanted to take more of Mexico, and the US negotiator was overcome by regret, morals, something. And so there was a lot of debate about how much actually should be taken. And it's not as if when the United States in the 1850s has just defeated Mexico that all of a sudden they're able to simply work their will. The United States, one of its first assertions of overseas power in the 1850s is the U.S. Guano Islands Act. They claim a bunch of rocks in the Pacific which has very valuable bird droppings, which is a fertilizer. It doesn't, they can assert this, but it doesn't actually happen. The United States tries to annex Cuba in the 1850s. It doesn't happen. The United States loses a war to the Lakota in the 1860s. So I guess one of the points I want to try to make is we all want a sort of orderly, smooth past. And one of the ways we try to do that, I think, is we look at the powerful state of the 20th century and we look at the United States having conquered this, gone from the Atlantic to the Pacific by the end of the 19th century. And we want to make that seem like it was always foreordained to be so. And when you look at what was happening in the middle of that century, it looks much more uneven and bumpier and far less foreordained. I hope that answers the question.
Absolutely kills me that Drew gets the last word, but I think it has to be the last question of the evening. So thank you, and please come back tomorrow.